Hi guys. Hi guys, this is Animesh, and today we're going to talk about cortisol. Cortisol is probably one of the most misunderstood hormones in the fitness industry because as soon as you say cortisol, you just think stress. So if there's high cortisol in the body, there's high stress. If there's high stress in the body, it's probably high cortisol. And that's just half information. The problem with half information is that it is always not applied in the best manner. So we cannot have ambiguity around terms like this. And that's why we need to understand the fundamentals of what cortisol is. And basically, what it is a biochemical, right? It's a chemical that exists within the body, it's produced within the body. So, whenever you're looking at biochemicals like that, there are a few things that you need to keep in mind to understand the fundamentals of it. And I feel like for us as fitness coaches, athletes, or just a curious person that is fitness and training oriented, if you know the why, how, and when of these biochemicals, that's enough information for you to gain some clarity on how you want to actually apply that information into your training regime or into your lifestyle. Because ultimately, as somebody that is into training and you build a lifestyle around it, that's why they call it a fitness lifestyle. You start peeling off the layers, and it's no longer about just going to the gym and lifting weights and looking good anymore. Once you start peeling back the layers, it becomes about the entire lifestyle. That's why they call it the fitness lifestyle. And so things like this are going to come up at some point of time, especially as you're aging. You are going to start worrying about and contemplating a lot about stress in the body because it directly affects your output, your ability to recover, and and consequently your progress as well. So cortisol, important to understand, important to remove all the ambiguity and all the misconceptions around it. So we'll get into the fundamentals of cortisol today quickly. I started getting into it. The reason why I'm doing a video on cortisol is because I was doing some research for a product that I'm trying to develop for endurance training. And in doing that research, I was studying the effects, the acute and chronic effects of aerobic training on free testosterone in the body. So I started getting into the fundamentals of testosterone. And then I came across cortisol because cortisol uh, quite like testosterone, they have similar sort of synthesis pathways. Sometimes they compete with each other. They have effects on each other. So quite interesting. Lots of studies done on both of these, the interplay of both of these hormones. So I got into cortisol as well, and then I realized that there is a misconception around cortisol and how we just consider it as stress, and that's what we're looking into today. So cortisol, guys, basically it's not stress. It's just a steroidal hormone. So hormone is basically like a chemical messenger that is produced by the endocrine gland in the body. So it's synthesized by these glands. It travels in the bloodstream and it reaches the organs where it is supposed to reach. Right. So the specific organs are sensitive to specific hormones. So the hormones are going to reach those organs. Those organs are going to receive those hormones, and then these hormones are going to create some sort of changes and serve some sort of functions in those organs. That's that's exactly what cortisol does. Now, in hormones, there are two categories of hormones. You have peptide hormones and then we have steroidal hormones. The commonality in all of the steroidal hormones is that the synthesis of steroidal hormones, they begin with cholesterol. Right? Cholesterol is metabolized and then the synthesis of the steroidal hormones start. That's what they have in common. And also the effect that they create in the target tissues or the organs, it happens at a genetic level. So it's going to bring about a change that happens at a genetic level. Right? There's some sort of transcription that's going to happen, expression of genes that's going to happen because of the steroidal hormones. Testosterone is an example, cortisol is an example, insulin is also an example. Not too sure about that, but we look into it anyway. So now getting into the how, why, and when of cortisol. The how is how does it occur? Like how does cortisol get synthesized in the body? Why does it get synthesized? Is the function, right? Because if cortisol is getting synthesized in the body, it is going to serve some sort of a function. And when does it get synthesized is about the trigger or the stimulus. There has to be some sort of a stimulus, and because of that stimulus, all this top down chain reaction starts, and these biochemicals, they start getting produced. There's some sort of an effect, and then again the effect, the synthesis, this regulation, and this effect of these biochemicals, they have to be curbed at some point, right? Otherwise, the production just can't keep going up. It starts getting synthesized. Let's say cortisol starts getting synthesized, and then it just never stops. So there has to be a negative feedback loop. There has to be some sort of a signal that the body or these target organs that are utilizing this hormone cortisol, they have to loop back to where the synthesis is happening and tell that gland to stop synthesizing the cortisol. So that's a negative feedback loop, right? Which curbs the synthesis of the or down regulates the regulation of cortisol in the body. So therein lies how you want to understand any biochemical that you want to inquire about. You might want to inquire about a lot of different things, right? As you start curious about things, you want to get to know about all of these things: testosterone, cortisol, insulin, and whatnot. So all of these are biochemicals. So what do you want to know about these biochemicals? If you are not, buying into just simply the hearsay of what you're looking on Instagram, you want to get to know the stimulus or the trigger right? When does this biochemical begin getting synthesized, right? What is the trigger? What is the stimulus? That's where you want to begin, right? You want to understand the synthesis of it. Okay, I got the trigger. Now, what happens when the trigger occurs? What does it trigger, right? And therein lies like the process of the synthesis. Like there will be substrates, there will be compounds that turn into other compounds, and finally you get the end product, which can start circulating in the bloodstream and reach your target organ. So the trigger, the synthesis, the function. When it reaches the target organ, when it starts regulating in the bloodstream, reach the target organs, it's going to serve some sort of a function. That's the whole point of it. So what function does it serve? You want to know that. And finally, you want to understand what is the negative feedback loop, right? So how is this going to stop? Like what is the trigger for this cycle to stop? So and this is a closed loop cycle. Usually these hormones run on closed loop cycles. It's going to be trigger, synthesis, function, and then the negative feedback loop. If you understand these four things about any biochemical that you're trying to look into, you're pretty sorted. You have enough information about it to then start basically asking more valid questions, better questions, right? That's all that we need. We need answers so that we can ask better questions. Then that's like a never-ending process. You can get into it as deep as you want. But this is where kind of like the legwork begins for the curious mind that is, inquisitive about training. So let's get into it. I've prepared like a small presentation. I'll quickly just go through this so that you guys have some information. And I don't know if it's relevant for you or not, but this hormone in general, quite popular, quite the buzzword, and quite misunderstood as well. So it's the biggest misconception that cortisol just means simply stress, which is not the case. It's like we said, cortisol, objectively, when you look at it, it's a chemical in the body. What sort of a chemical is it? It's a hormone. And then you have categories of hormones. So this is a steroidal hormone. All steroidal hormones are synthesized from cholesterol. So they're lipid soluble, fat soluble, and they initiate genetic responses in the target cells, right? So to reiterate this again, a gland, an endocrine gland, is going to basically secrete a hormone. A steroidal hormone has a genetic effect on the target cell. So we have this entry point and this destination. Destination is the target cells, and cells make up tissues and organs. So the target organs that are sensitive to this particular hormone that is being produced, right? Irrespective of what hormone it is or what tissue it is of the body, all tissues are sensitive to some sort of hormones because they need some functions happening in them that these hormones can make happen for them. So these tissues are sensitive to this hormone. There is going to be some sort of a trigger that is going to trigger the synthesis and the release, the secretion of this hormone into the bloodstream. Once this gland gets that trigger, it starts synthesizing and secreting this hormone into the bloodstream. Now the hormone is going to travel to the organs that are sensitive to this. These organs that are sensitive to this particular hormone, they're going to have some receptors. These hormones are going to go and get attached to those receptors, and then the functions begin. Then it starts serving some functions. There are going to be genetic changes, non-genetic changes, all of those things. So steroidal hormones usually cause genetic changes in those target cells. So the many functions that the hormone cortisol serves is that it is going to increase blood glucose via gluconeogenesis. This is a process that happens in the liver, where in the liver it produces glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. So usually the carbohydrates that we consume are broken down to its very base form, and glucose is derived out of it. But sometimes when that's just not available in times of stress, right, when your body is running low on fuel and it needs to produce fuel, it needs to produce energy. So it's going to depend on the non-carb sources, and the liver is what does this. So gluconeogenesis is a production process for producing glucose that happens in the liver, and it's going to utilize non-carb sources and produce glucose from it. So cortisol is kind of going to upregulate this function. Then it also breaks down muscle protein into amino acids for energy, and then it mobilizes fat for fuel during prolonged stress or fasting. So if you see, basically what cortisol is doing is in a state of energy deficit, right? And the body is running low on fumes. So if the body is running on fumes and running low on fuel, cortisol basically upregulates the energy production from all three of these macronutrients that we know about, right? So it's going to get glucose, it's going to break down amino acid, and it's going to break down fatty acids and produce energy from all three of these things. Then it's also going to kind of suppress the immune system. So one of the things that the immune system does is that it's going to basically protect your body against foreign matter, right? Whenever it sees some foreign matter that it deems as dangerous, it's going to activate an immune response against it. So one of the things that cortisol does is that it's just going to ask the immune system to, just like chill it for a second so that the body can prioritize on survival. And then another thing that cortisol does is that it reduces the production of pro-inflammatory cytokines. So cytokines are basically these signaling molecules. So like let's say there is a site of injury in the body. So pro-inflammatory cytokines are going to get activated, and then they are going to start attracting all the inflammatory files. Everything that can cause inflammation in that joint, in that site of injury, is going to attract all of those things, macrophages and all of these things that can clear up the debris and then start forming the new matter over the site of injury. So when in the process of healing of an injury, there is a pro-inflammatory phase and then there is an anti-inflammatory phase. The pro-inflammatory phase is where it's like the initial part of healing, right? So this is where we are clearing up the debris, and this is where the inflammation is required. So the cytokines are the signaling molecules that kind of initiate this cascade of events. So when there is cortisol regulating in the bloodstream, it's going to suppress this as well. It modulates alertness, memory, focus, and emotion, right? And it supports the circadian rhythm. So cortisol usually it basically is upregulated and reaches a peak during early morning to help you wake up. So naturally, you'll have high cortisol in the body. That's why a lot of you guys must have heard Andrew Huberman say that you don't need coffee in the first 90 minutes that you wake up, because your body is going to, if your circadian clock is set, right, if it's working on time, the melatonin release is not phase shifted, and you're waking up early in the morning, then during that time, the cortisol is going to reach its natural peak, and it's going to be enough to give you alertness, focus, help you feel emotionally regulated, and all of those things. And you don't really need caffeine to do that for you during that time. So you can basically avoid caffeine, delay it for a little bit, and let the cortisol do its thing, right? Natural stress wakes you up. And what also works with cortisol also works with aldosterone to retain sodium and excrete potassium in this kind of happens in the kidney. So aldosterone is basically going to, what it basically does is it's another hormone that is going to retain sodium in the body whenever it sees that the hydration status of the body is going for a toss. So it sees that the body's hydration status is low and sodium is basically being excreted in urine. So it's going to retain some of that sodium to maintain to upregulate the hydration status of the body. So if you kind of go through all of these functions of cortisol, you'll realize that cortisol is a very, very important hormone that ensures survival of the body, right? So whenever you're in an alerted fight or flight state, right, when the sympathetic system of the body, if body is in the sympathetic fight or flight mode, right, you're just burning through energy, you're running low on fuel, you're emotionally charged up, and the brain is just sensing a lot of stress from the surrounding, or the brain is sensing a lot of stress from the body. This is when cortisol does its trick. It is secreted into the bloodstream, and it is going to kind of down regulate the stress. Just kind of try to curb it so that you can focus on what's the primary goal at that moment, which is survival. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky because all of this is happening internally. Whether there is an actual need for survival or not, whether you're in a state where you're actually in survival mode or whether that's just your body sensing that you're in that mode, are two different things. But either way, the cortisol is upregulated whenever the body feels like it needs to prioritize survival. So let's look at the synthesis, how cortisol is synthesized and when it is synthesized, which is basically the triggers or the stimulus that starts all of this off. So the first thing that's going to happen, like I said, is going to be some sort of a physical, emotional stress, or it's just going to be like the low energy status of the body, right? So hypoglycemia. And there's low blood sugar, low glucose in the blood. That's received as a stress signal by the brain. So it can be a physical stress, it can be emotional stress, or it can be hypoglycemia. This stress signal is received by the hypothalamus in the brain, which is going to start releasing the corticotropin releasing hormone. The CRH is basically the first substrate that is going to start off this cascade of events through this axis, right? Through this conjunction of three glands: the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the adrenal gland, right? So this through this axis is where the secretion of this production of the synthesis pathway of cortisol occurs. So it starts off in the hypothalamus, which receives a stress signal, physical stress, emotional stress, lack of blood sugar, and low blood sugar. And then the hypothalamus is going to start releasing CRH. Then we go down, the CRH goes down to the anterior pituitary gland, which responds by releasing ACTH, so adrenocorticotropic hormone. And then the ACTH goes down to the adrenal cortex, right? So the zona fasciculata. And it is stimulated by the ACTH that it receives. And then cortisol is synthesized and released into the bloodstream. So this is the synthesis pathway, right? So HPA axis. And if I'm not wrong, the testosterone pathway is the HPG axis. So similar sort of pathways. That's why they compete with each other. And this is one of the reasons why when there is high regulating cortisol in the body, it's going to suppress the testosterone secretion. So this is how the synthesis happens. Now let's look at the triggers. These are the many triggers that can start off this process. So all of this starts off kind of at the hypothalamus that releases the CRH. This is the first step that needs to happen in the synthesis pathway of cortisol, right? The trigger for this is some sort of a stress signal that it is received. Now let's look at how and what is being perceived as stress. There are different parts of the brain. So the amygdala, it perceives fear, threat, or emotional stress, right? And this is perceived as a stress, and this is going to stimulate the secretion of CRH in the hypothalamus, right? Corticotropin releasing hormone. The prefrontal cortex, it's constantly evaluating cognitive, emotional conflict or uncertainty. Different parts of the brain, different sense threat inputs, And then you got the hippocampus, which is comparing the current situation with past stressful memories. It's fucking baggage. That's what this is. All right. And then you got the brainstem that's relaying physiological stress like pain or low blood pressure. So when we say pain, that's some sort of physical stress, low blood pressure, hypoglycemia. All these things, amygdala, prefrontal cortex, and the hippocampus, they're kind of taking account of the emotional stress state of the body. All of these things are going to kind of positively stimulate the hypothalamus, and it's going to trigger the hypothalamus to start producing the CRH. Then you get the cascade of events down the HPA axis. Starts off the hypothalamus, CRH goes down, stimulates the anterior pituitary gland, which is going to release the ACTH, the adrenocorticotropic hormone. That's going to go down to the adrenal cortex, and it's going to stimulate the adrenal cortex, and that is where the cortisol is synthesized and released into the bloodstream. The hypothalamus, like we saw here, is constantly measuring blood glucose, so metabolic stress, right? Low blood sugar, hypoglycemia. It's also measuring body temperature, osmolality, and the fluid balance, so the hydration status of the body, inflammatory signals, right? And then hormonal feedback. So hormonal feedback is the negative feedback loop that we were talking about. So the trigger of the production of cortisol are these stress factors: emotional, physical, metabolic stress, right? Low glucose. But now, what if the glucose is upregulated, right? And what if there is like a lot of cortisol regulating in the blood? So we need something to curb the synthesis of cortisol as well. We need a negative feedback loop, right? Like a fuse. And that is basically this hormonal feedback. So if there's high cholesterol, it's going to loop back into where this is being synthesized in the hypothalamus, where the synthesis starts, and to curb some step so that the release of the cortisol is curbed as well. And we can basically achieve hormonal balance. Otherwise, this thing would just go out of whack. So it acts as like a biological sensor hub, the hypothalamus, right? We kind of had a look over here. So it acts like a biological sensor hub, sensing everything: physical stress, emotional stress, metabolic stress. And then it derives data from the nervous system, the immune system, the endocrine systems. So it's giving data from all of these things. It's quite nice how this shit just works like a computer, right? So it's quite complex, but that's exactly what it works like. And then this is how the synthesis of the cortisol is regulated. So you got upregulation when we sense stress, when the stress is resolved, when the blood glucose is high, and when all of these, depending on what sort of feedback you're getting from the immune system, nervous system, and endocrine system, the secretion of cortisol will either be upregulated or it will be down. That's how balance is achieved. Things kind of go out of control. So basically, what we're trying to get at is that cortisol is not bad. In basically cortisol in acute response to stress is one of the best things that can happen for the body. That's why it's there. That's why it exists. Right? Because it takes care of all of these things. It's going to ensure that you survive. It's going to give you energy, even if you don't have too much energy to begin with in the body. Right? It's going to suppress your immune system so that you can focus more on survival in the now and in the here and now. Because a lot of the immune responses basically ask you to just relax, rest, step off the gas. But maybe you're in a survival situation where you just don't have the opportunity or the affordability to do that. You need to ensure survival. This is like cortisol kicks in, suppresses the immune response, and helps you focus on the task at hand, which is surviving. Then it is also going to suppress the inflammation process in the body, right? Because if inflammation occurs, it's going to hurt. And it's going to hurt, it's going to slow down movement. It's going to affect your chances of surviving if you're in a tricky situation. So it suppresses that. But the problem really occurs is that all of these things, right? This high production, this amped up production of energy, suppression of the immune system, suppression of the inflammatory cycle, and all of these things that cortisol helps you do in the short term is great for survival. But if this secretion and regulation of cortisol is never curbed, it's never downregulated, and if it goes out of whack, basically, if you're chronically for a long periods of time, if you're in a state where a lot of cortisol is circulating through your body, then the very things that were helping you survive, they become pathological in the long run because yes, you need glucose as energy to survive, and it's going to derive energy from all of these substrate, break down muscle, it's going to break down fatty acids, it's going to get glucose from gluconeogenesis in the liver. But like let's say if cortisol is chronically high in the body, basically what's happening is your muscle is constantly breaking down to produce energy, right? And your muscles are in like a catabolic state. And if your glucose is constantly high in the blood, then that's like a problem as well. Now you're in a state of hyperglycemia. There's more than required glucose in the bloodstream, right? And that is going to basically cause insulin resistance. And then if your cortisol is chronically high in the body, that's going to directly affect your sleep cycle. Because the sleep cycle it runs on like a 24-hour clock. Your melatonin is secreted in the night, that's what induces the sleep. Cortisol is secreted in the morning, it peaks in the morning, that's what causes alertness and wakefulness. But if the cortisol is constantly high, it's going to basically hinder your ability to fall asleep, get good quality sleep, and that whole circadian rhythm is going to go out of whack. And again, like I said, HPA axis, HPG axis, they're competing, sort of competing pathways. So an HPG axis is through which the testosterone secretion cascade runs, and HP axis through which the cortisol secretion pathway runs. So in the cortisol pathway, it's like this one highway, and cortisol is taking up all of it, right? So because HPA ends in the adrenal cortex, HPG ends in the gonads, which is where the testosterone is produced. So HP is the same; it's the same highway. So this cortisol is taking up the highway. There is not going to be enough space for the secretion of testosterone, right? So that testosterone cascade is going to be shunted and stunted. So that's a problem again. So high cortisol in the short run, great. Cortisol in the long run is going to constantly make you feel anxious. It's going to disrupt your emotional regulation. Always going to be alert. Always going to be running on fumes. You're constantly breaking down muscle for energy, mobilizing fat for energy. Gluconeogenesis is through the roof. Your immune system is suppressed. Your inflammatory processes are suppressed. So the healing is happening slow. The debris clearance, whenever there's a site of injury, all of that resolution of the injury is happening is now hampered. It's quite slow, and you have reduced glycogen stores. You have poor endurance capacity. Because glycogen is is all of this constantly being used to produce energy, because your body is sensing that you are in flight or fight mode. You are in need of survival, and then you got slower muscle repair and regeneration as well, because of course your muscle is constantly in a catabolic state where it's being broken down into its base substrate to for energy. It's not going to be the anabolic state of that muscle cell is not going to be that good. So cortisol in the short run, great for survival. Chronically high regulating cortisol through the body in the long run, it just suppresses all of these good functions that you need, right? And it's just bad for the body. So let's talk about the takeaways of this video. The takeaways, guys, here is a little bit more meta. So we learned about cortisol, but I want you to understand that I am not a cortisol expert. But then again, when I want to inquire about cortisol, I have a template now. Like it's easy for me, even though I'm not an expert, right? You can have two paths here. You can just say to yourself, "Oh, I'm not a biochemist. I can't do this. And let me just go ask a biochemist." You do that and just never look into anything. But if you're curious, if you're inherently curious, and you want to increase your knowledge base so that you can ask better questions, you can audit yourself, ask better questions. You want to get into knowing these things, understanding these things at a level that is not just hearsay or not just derived from Instagram. So this is basically how the study process works. You want to understand all biochemicals under the context of a stimulus or a trigger, the synthesis, and the metabolism of it, the pathway that it's going to take, and then the function it serves, right? And then what is going to curb this process? What is going to regulate this process? So these are the four things: the trigger, the synthesis, the function, and then how is it going to be curbed? The negative feedback loop. So when if you understand any sort of biochemicals, some examples that you can practice this on, like try to study about adrenaline, try to study about insulin, or vitamin D or hormone D. All of these For all of these hormones to be produced, they need a trigger. Then they have a synthesis. Then they serve a function, and then this process is curbed, right? And then if this process is not curbed, and there is like abnormally high amounts of these hormones running in the body, then those are going to have some effects in the long run. So you can study all of that and you can practice it with these. But this is really my takeaway from this lesson. It's not. This was yes to give you some information about cortisol, but more than that, the meta concept here is that you can take autonomy about your own education and understand whatever the fuck it is that you want to understand, right? And not feel underconfident about inquiry. Inquiry is very important. This is a template for inquiry, and that's really my takeaway. So I'm going to see you guys for the next one. And if there have been any mistakes in this video, just fucking forgive me, man. Like I'm also trying to study and learn. I'm not an expert here, but self-education is your should be your number one priority if you're a coach or an athlete or a curious person that's concerned about training. And yeah, this shit is fun. So I'll see you guys for the next one. And yeah, I'm going to drop some very interesting videos in the realm of aerobic training. I was looking into aerobic training, and that's how I got into this in the first place. So I'm developing this product, this sort of endurance toolkit for coaches, athletes. It's going to be quite extensive. I'm putting in a lot of research work into it. So it's going to be quite extensive. It's going to be quite amazing, quite useful. Let me know if you guys are interested in that, and I'm going to give you guys like the pre-sale link. It's going to be super cheap. I'm going to give in a lot of freebies in that, and I might as well pick some of you to help me with the product research, product development side of things. All depends on how curious you are and how much you want to have fun with it. So let me know yours. All right, so I'll see you guys for the next one. Bye bye.